Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Shoulders Up podcast, where we break down complex headaches and dizziness. I have a very special guest today. We are joined by Julian Verdi. She is a pivotal leader in the fight for headache disorder awareness and the executive director of the Alliance for Headache Disorders Advocacy, or AHDA. So she's a lawyer by training, and she's here today to discuss the mission of Headache on the Hill, an event that brings patients, providers, and advocates directly to lawmakers in Capitol Hill. So with her background in law and systemic change, Julian is helping lead the charge to secure federal research funding and improve access to care for the millions living with migraine and headache disorders. So if you're a listener and you're someone who lives with headache disorders and you don't know who Julian is, I just want you to know that she is really fighting for you. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that she's probably one of the leading voices in headache advocacy currently. So I'm really excited to have her on. Julian, how you doing today?
Wow, thanks so much for having me.
Let's just dive right in here. So, we know people with headache disorders are incredibly underserved. They often don't have access to the right resources, and I would say that many probably aren't even aware that advocacy groups exist. I mean, I certainly didn't know for a long time. So could you tell our listeners about what exactly this advocacy group does and how that work can impact their lives directly?
I think that's really such an important point. A lot of people don't realize there's even advocacy happening in this space, and I actually didn't either until I got this job, to be honest. I'd say at its core, the Alliance for Headache Disorders Advocacy is really focused on turning the lived experience of people living with migraine and headache disorders into policy change at all levels of government. That means we work directly with Congress to try to advance legislation and educate policymakers about what migraine and headache disorders are and push for better access to care and more research funding. But where this really, I think, becomes real for people is really thinking about how the things that we're doing and what we're advocating for really impact everyday lives. And I would say the policies that we're working on determine whether someone can see a specialist in the first place, whether their treatment is covered by insurance, whether they can access health through telehealth services, or whether they're stuck trying medications that don't work for them before they can get access to a medication that their clinician prescribes. We also bring patients and clinicians directly to the process and directly to lawmakers. So through Headache on the Hill, we train advocates from across the country and then support them in meeting with lawmakers to tell their stories, because ultimately that's what we think drives change, and that's our sort of theory of change. Data matters, statistics matter, but at the end of the day, it's the lived experiences, putting a face and the name to the 40 million Americans living with migraine and headache disorders that is ultimately going to change hearts and minds and make these issues impossible to ignore.
I see. Yeah. So just kind of building on that, I love what you said about the stories of the advocates. So I had the opportunity to join Headache on the Hill this year, and there were over 300 advocates, and I saw you kind of running around getting everybody in order. It's really incredible how we're able to get everyone on the same page and aligned. And I would say everybody also knew what the general strategy was for getting the most out of our meetings with the lawmakers to create real change. And I really loved what you said about the stories. In practice rounds, I got to hear a lot of stories myself. I work as a physical therapist in this headache realm. I see people with headache every day, and even I started learning from these stories about situations I had no idea about, as well as variants of headache disorders. Right. And other comorbidities that come with it. So it just really goes to show that this world of headache is actually really, really, really deep, and most people just don't know. So as a lawyer, there are many routes that you can go. So what drew you specifically to headache advocacy?
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. I definitely did not set out to work in the headache space. As you know, I'm a lawyer by trade, and when I went to law school, I knew that I probably didn't want to be spending time in a courtroom. Like, that wasn't my vision of what my career would look like. I always really liked policy, so I thought I would be somewhere in the government relations and advocacy space. And so when I left law school, after I graduated law school and passed the bar and all those fun things, one of my first jobs out of law school was as the director of government relations for Planned Parenthood of New York City. And that's where I learned a lot of the skills that I still use today. At the same time, I was living with migraine. I had had headaches as as a child. That became much more severe when I was a teenager, and then worse still in college, and really, really bad once I got to law school. But migraine was also just really normal in my family. My mom had migraine mostly in her 20s. My dad had what we thought was sinus headache, right? That's what he would call them all the time. He'd say he had sinus headache, and I would wake up in the morning and I'd come downstairs and he'd have a cup of coffee on his face because the heat from the coffee like felt good on that one-sided pain, right? Always one-sided with light sensitivity and all the things. Really, we didn't know that that was migraine until I literally got this job. So even though I knew I had migraine, I was not formally diagnosed until law school. And really that only happened because I was starting to experience migraine with aura. And so those visual disturbances were so severe that I thought something more serious was going on. I thought I was having seizures or something. I wasn't, what is happening in my body? And so I finally saw a neurologist. And that's when I was formally diagnosed with migraine and realized that there were even treatment options out there. And I think that that's a story that we hear often, that people grow up in migraine households. And so it just becomes normal to have a headache every day. Right. And one of the things that I've tried to talk to when I talk to people is say, if that's not normal, and if that's something that you're experiencing, there is help out there, and you should get into treatment, because we know that migraine can be a progressive disease. And the more attacks you have, the more your brain gets sensitized, and you can progress. Right. So anyway, I saw a neurologist, but the issue was that there really weren't great treatment options out there for me. This was before the newer therapies that we have now. I was prescribed one medication, an anti-seizure medication. But unfortunately, I couldn't tolerate the side effects. And after, a couple of months on it, I was told to get off because it was wreaking havoc on my body, and basically told at that point that I just needed to rely on acute medications and just manage the best as I could. So I did that for many years, just mostly taking over-the-counter medications, living with this disease while also building a career in law, policy, and advocacy. After Planned Parenthood, I started my own law practice, doing a mix of legal work, nonprofit management and consulting, some government relations work, and even started a social justice grassroots organizing nonprofit in New York City. And one thing is, when you have your own consulting firm and go out on your own, you're always looking for new clients. And I came across a job description for an executive director, and really the first paid hire for Alliance for Headache Disorders Advocacy. And it really stopped me in my tracks. I remember thinking, I didn't know advocacy existed in this space. And at the same time, it felt like the most perfect intersection of everything that I had been doing professionally, combining, that nonprofit management experience, the grassroots organizing, government relations, and policy work. And then to take all of that and advocate for something I was actually living with, it just seems so fortuitous. And so then I stepped into this role, and I've been there almost 5 years now. And during this time that I was in this role, my son was also diagnosed with migraine, and that added a whole other layer to this. And what was so great is because I was in this world and starting to learn so much about it, I was able to recognize what was going on with my son and quickly get him the care that he needed, which I'm really grateful for. But I think it also really reinforced for me how important this work is, because not every family has access and awareness. And for me, that access and awareness has been able to, to help my family and help myself. Like, I'm in a different treatment plan than I was when I first took this job, because I've learned so much. And I want everybody, every headache patient, to have the same access and care that I do, or even better. And so this work for me is both professional and personal, and it's really about using those skills that I've built throughout my career in policy and advocacy to really improve systems for people living with a disease that I know firsthand.
Did you ever have to take any time off in law school or anything? It sounds like your symptoms were pretty disabling at one point.
Yeah, so I didn't have to take time off of law school, but I remember so many experiences where, my attacks were so severe that I would, miss class or things like that. And there were times where it was so bad. I kind of have distinct memories of kind of my worst attacks, where I would be lying on the bathroom floor in my apartment because the cold tile is the only thing that felt good in that moment, and the nausea and the vomiting, etc., and being so desperate, and finally, calling my dad, and, actually him coming to the house and coming and finding me on the floor and, carrying me and putting me back into bed and helping me. And I remember he just held my head, just the counter pressure on my head, and just someone to sit with you when you're in such a vulnerable position, right? And, those were really dark times. And, I think about so many times where that happened throughout my life, where it was severe attack after severe attack. And no one said, maybe you should go to the doctor for this, right? That this is not a normal experience. And I think, again, when you grow up in a house where having, pretty severe headache is normalized, you don't realize that this is a chronic neurological disease where you should get help, right? You shouldn't have to live like this.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know migraine is largely genetic. So definitely if we hear about a family history, it definitely starts sending some alarm bells. You didn't get a formal diagnosis until you're probably in your 20s, right? So
Right.
you're living a long time without the appropriate treatments. And for some people, it's not always so clear that their headache might be migraine in nature. But you're right, it does get normalized. Some people just think it's the way life is. For those of you listening, I think one quick tip that I have for a lot of people, if you're living with headache, you're not sure whether it warrants going to the doctor. There's a questionnaire out there called the Headache Impact Test. I use a lot. It's only 6 questions. It'll take less than a minute, and it'll give you an idea of just how severe your quote-unquote normal headache might be. And oftentimes when I submit it, most people, they're like, oh yeah, I get headaches every day just like the rest of my family. And then fill out the questionnaire, and then it says you are in the severe category with a major impact on your life and you need to go see a neurologist. So yeah, just kind of going off that, if you're living with a headache disorder and you're listening to this, just go get the help you need. We have much better tools now than we used to. And with all this advocacy work we're doing, I am pretty hopeful that we're going to keep finding better therapies and better treatments for everyone. So going back to Headache on the Hill, I had joined this past February. It was a really cool experience. It was actually my first time in DC. So first time in DC, and I got a feel of what the political process was kind of like. And we were there to advocate for 3 different acts: the Headache Act, the STEP Act, and the Connect Act. So can you detail what these 3 separate acts do?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the Headache Act is the one that we're most focused on right now because it's really a historic moment for this community. It is the first federal bill specifically for migraine and headache disorders, which is pretty remarkable to think about, in 2026, that there's never been a bill that specifically addressed this condition that impacts 40 million Americans. But what this bill really does is it directs the federal government to develop a coordinated national strategy to address the crisis of headache in our community, in our country. So what it would do is bring together different agencies that touch people living with headache. And that's everything from NIH, and research funding, and CDC, and FDA, and the VA, all of the acronyms that you can think of in the federal government. It brings them together in a council. And in that advisory council, there would also be patients, and clinicians and researchers and care partners dictated in the bill that both federal and non-federal experts would come together on this advisory council and really focus on understanding what's going on with migraine and headache disorders in this country and what do we need to do better, and deliver a national plan annually, basically a strategic plan to address this crisis. It's going to look at gaps in provider training, which we know is a huge issue for us because many patients never see a specialist and are often misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed. And if we can get folks treated earlier, if we can get more primary care clinicians to be able to treat, that would help us in this when we know we have a shortage of neurologists and especially headache trained neurologists. It'll also look at things like screening and diagnosis, right? If we could get migraine to be a part of an annual screening, that alone, we can get folks diagnosed early and into treatment early and prevent that progression from episodic to chronic. At a high level, it's really about creating alignment and accountability at the federal level. And we hope that translates to earlier diagnosis, more trained providers, more research, and better access to care. And then the other 2 bills, the Safe STEP Act addresses step therapy. And this is an insurance practice that many patients, if not all patients, have probably experienced at one point or another. And this is where basically your clinician prescribes a therapy for you, but before your insurance company will cover that medication, they require you to try and fail several other therapies, sometimes for months and sometimes many different steps. So many trialing 2, 3, 4 different medications before you can access that treatment that your doctor originally prescribed. And for migraine patients and headache patients in particular, this can mean prolonged suffering, delays in getting effective care, and then again, that progression from episodic to chronic. The bill, the Safe Step Act, would create clearer exemptions to step therapy protocols. It doesn't get rid of step therapy altogether, but it creates 5 different exemptions, categories, and a process that would have to be, the insurance companies would have to make those decisions very quickly. And, it would really help migraine patients and headache disorder patients get to the appropriate care in a quicker way. We think that that's really, really important for our community. And then finally, the Connect for Health Act is focused on telehealth, another really important tool for our community. During COVID, Medicare expanded telehealth flexibility so providers could continue caring for patients remotely. And that made a huge difference. And, the world has completely changed since COVID, and this is more normalized, right? And especially for people living with migraine and headache disorders, travel can be really difficult and really triggering. This is a really important mechanism for accessing care for migraine and headache patients. The issue is what Congress keeps doing is just kind of attaching, these sort of temporary extensions and kicking the can down the road. And what ends up happening is, we have government shutdowns, we have stalemates in Congress, and the politics keeps getting in the way. And we've seen lapses of the telehealth flexibility. So what we're asking for is, this bill to be passed to make this permanent and have it, no longer be used as sort of a political football back and forth, because that is not good for patients, it's not good for clinicians, and we know we can do better than that.
Yeah, so with those 3 acts, we're really addressing the most common barriers that a lot of headache patients are dealing with. The way things are currently set up, I think it really prolongs suffering for a lot of people. On average, it takes about 7 years for a person to get diagnosed with migraine. In regards to the annual screening you mentioned, they're just starting to incorporate that for guidelines now for teenage women to include that in their screening, which honestly should have just been the baseline for a long time already now. And then the Headache Act, I can't stress the importance of a national strategy for headache, because right now, like you mentioned, it seems very disjointed. But, we've recently had these new therapies come out that were really quite revolutionary. Less than 10 years ago, the anti-CGRP medications. I believe they are the first medication that was specifically designed for migraine prevention. So for those of you who don't know, before that, for migraine prevention, they were using medications from other kind of disorders and using it to treat migraine. So an example, anti-seizure is Topamax, right? It was an anti-seizure medication, and then they found out, hey, it can help with migraine. So let's also give people Topamax. Verapamil is a blood pressure medication, and that's the same thing that happened. So when these anti-CGRP medications came out, it's the first one. And I think that just goes to show that they're really just the tip of the iceberg. There's actually so much more that they can do, especially when you look into the pathophysiology. There's a lot of opportunity for affecting change, but the problem is we don't have the funding, and we don't have the urgency, and we don't have this focused approach to doing it. I'm really a huge believer that if we can get this Headache Act through, as well as some of these other policies, I think they're really going to be able to start finding really, really effective therapies, especially for those who maybe didn't respond to the anti-CGRPs. So what do you think are some unique challenges that headache advocacy faces versus other disorders, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the biggest challenges is that headache disorders as a whole sits in a really complicated space where they're both incredibly common and then yet widely misunderstood. And that's sort of just a strange concept to wrap your head around. But I think it's largely because, again, they're invisible conditions. People often look fine from the outside, though I would challenge that and say if you look closely, you can often see the physical pain manifested in someone's face. If you're close to someone, you'll probably notice that. My family can see when I'm not doing well because there's a shift in your face. But generally, you look fine on the outside to the rest of the world, even when you're still experiencing pretty severe neurological symptoms. So, I think it's easy for people to underestimate how disabling they really are. There's a lot of stigma. Headache disorders, especially migraine, are still often thought of as just a headache, which really minimizes the reality of the disease and how seriously patients are taken, not just socially, but with the like greater healthcare system in general. I think another layer is that migraine and headache disorders, disproportionately impacting women, particularly during those most productive years. And historically, conditions that impact women have been underfunded, underprioritized. And I think you see that really reflected here. And then again, this issue about how common they are. You would think that would lead to more attention, but I think in some ways it has the opposite effect because so many people have experienced a headache at some point in their life. Maybe they drank too much the night before or something like that, right? And it's the assumption that they understand these conditions because they've had a headache. When reality, this is a spectrum disorder, and you having a headache after drinking too much is not the same as a person living with hemiplegic migraine who is experiencing one-sided paralysis during a migraine attack, right? Those are two completely separate things, but I think it's hard for people who are on that other side of the spectrum to really understand those who are most impacted and in those most severe ways. So I think you end up with a situation where you have a group of conditions that are highly prevalent, highly disabling, and yet are just not treated with the urgency that I think that they deserve. And I think that, those realities really make advocacy both challenging and really necessary.
Yeah, amen to that. We really have a lot of people dealing with this, and they're definitely underrepresented. So headaches can be really, really disabling. Often makes people feel like they've exhausted all their options if they're not in the right place. But I do think it's really important that we remain hopeful. I think you and I are kind of case in point. We both had periods where we had very, very severe headache, kind of in a dark place. I had to take two years off of work, actually, before I felt like I could get better. But objectively speaking, we've seen a lot of progress in migraine management over the past 30 years, from development of the triptans and then to Botox and then finally the anti-CGRPs, which came out recently, real game changer. I guess with the work that you're doing, what are some things that you feel optimistic about in this headache space?
Yeah, I think you mentioned some of them. I think there are a lot of reasons to be genuinely hopeful right now. I think, as you mentioned, on the clinical side, we've really seen some real progress with treatments that have been evolving, like the CGRP therapies that have been life-changing for so many patients. But I think what's even more exciting is the science is continuing to evolve. We're still learning about the underlying mechanisms of migraine and other headache disorders, and that opens the door to better treatment options and new therapies coming in the years to come. I've been watching some of the news and clinical trials happening. There is stuff in the pipeline, and that is really exciting to see because for so long there wasn't. And with the CGRPs being that first class, going to be additional coming behind them. And I think that's something to be hopeful for. And it's not just that we've made progress, it's that I think that there's a lot more ahead. And on the policy side, I think we're seeing that momentum as well with the introduction of the Headache Act. I mean, again, that's just such a major milestone for our community. And I think really reflects a shift towards recognizing headache disorders as a serious public health issue that requires a coordinated response. We're also building on other successes. I think some examples of recent successes. About a year and a half now, we actually got guidelines out from the Department of Education. They're 504 guidelines that specifically say that kids experiencing migraine are eligible for 504 plans and IEPs and potentially even IEPs in school. That's huge. I mean, it's something we should have been the baseline, but to actually have this guidance out from the Department of Education, and this was a Headache on the Hill ask. This came directly from our advocacy for under Headache on the Hill several years ago, to have this piece of paper from the federal government saying, nope, migraine and headache disorders absolutely can be a disability and they need to be treated as such in the schools. I think that's a huge deal. Like, I didn't get any of that type of support in school, right? But now, kids like my son and others, they have this piece of paper that their families can utilize to go in and advocate for the supports that they need in school. And I think that is really, really important. And we're going to really try to continue to build upon that. So one of the things that we've been working on, we secured appropriations report language supporting the idea of adding migraine and headache disorders to the CDC's Healthy Schools program, for example. And this is a program that operates in 7 17 states, and it really helps school districts manage chronic health conditions for kids. And that includes like asthma and epilepsy, but migraine and headache disorders are not currently in the program. And so, Congress has expressed support for the idea of adding migraine and headache disorders into that program, which is really exciting. Now we need the CDC to follow through, so we're continuing to work on that. We've also got similar report language around, again, screening for women in the Well Woman visit. Still, it doesn't mean that's happening yet, but Congress is saying, hey, this is something to look at. We agree. Something's happening here. We should be looking at it. And that really empowers our advocacy. So I think that more broadly, I'm encouraged by, these advances, and I think we're going to continue pushing forward. And I'm really encouraged generally about the growth of the advocacy movement itself. In the nearly 5 years that I have had the privilege of leading this work, I've seen remarkable growth in the number of advocates and organizations and partners that are engaged in this space. If you look at the pictures from the earlier Headache on the Hills to where we are now, it's huge. And I think that's really, really exciting. And the offices themselves are, remembering us because we're coming twice a year to Congress. And so staffers are remembering us, and it's building this momentum and greater understanding. And then finally, I'd say projects like Flags for Headache, which is our big Migraine and Headache Awareness Month program and advocacy campaign, I think are really helping to make the invisible disease more visible in a very public way. And I think there's just a growing sense that we're just not willing to accept the status quo anymore. We want more recognition, we want more research, more treatment options, more headache specialists, and ultimately more good days. And we're not going to stop until we get that. And, there's a whole community here that is galvanized and working towards that goal. So I think that that's encouraging too, knowing there's a community out here. You don't need to suffer in silence and alone. There's a community ready to welcome you, and together we're going to ensure that our voices are heard.
Yeah. When it comes to headache advocacy, I think people often just think of research, right? They just think, okay, we're going to get the research to get better treatments and better therapies out. But I really liked some of the other things you mentioned, which is proper policy that reflects that this is actually a disability for a lot of people, and giving them formal documentation so that they can show, especially at schools. You mentioned, I don't think people even know that pediatric migraine is a thing that affects a lot of children. And going beyond that, also improving screening processes, right? Making sure that we're screening people for migraine or other headache disorders at the appropriate time, because we also know that earlier treatment also leads to better outcomes. If left untreated for a long time, I think it's pretty well established that people do get more sensitive over time. So just getting people through the door before it becomes a serious problem, is also really, really important. I think we'll go ahead and start wrapping up. So where can people learn more about what you're doing? How can they get involved? And how can we all help you get this legislation through?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the best place to start is our website. It's Alliance for Headache advocacy.org. From there, you can learn more about the work that we're doing, the legislation that we're advocating for, and most importantly, take action. So we'll have take action forms on that website where you just click a link, you enter your name, your address, and you can send a quick letter off to your members of Congress and senators in support of the bills that we're working on. Members of Congress care about their constituents and what they have to say. So this is a really important way to show that there's momentum behind this, and that their constituents, people who live in their district, care about these issues. So that is first and foremost, and one of the easiest things that you can do. You can also follow us on social media. We regularly share updates and advocacy opportunities and ways to stay engaged. I'd also say, join us for Headache on the Hill. Headache on the Hill is 2 times a year. So the next one is actually virtual. It will be on September 29th. Applications are going to open on June 1st. And what's great about the virtual, it's a little less of a commitment, in terms of having to physically travel to Washington, D.C. So it's really, I think a great introduction to this program and the advocacy. And so, I'd really encourage folks to join us on that. And I'll just want to emphasize that you don't need to be a policy expert to be a part of Headache on the Hill. All it takes is your personal story, whether that's as a patient or as a clinician, a care partner, or a researcher. You have a story to tell, and we're going to help you learn how to use that story to impact policy change. and we provide all the training and help you through that process. Because I think that's really the most powerful thing that you can do is tell your story, get us out of the shadows, make this disease more visible and impossible to ignore. And then, finally, I'd say, we have Migraine and Headache Awareness Month coming up in June. And so that's a great opportunity to, start telling your story, whether that's on social media or we have a proclamation toolkit where you can request a proclamation for Migraine and Headache Awareness Month from your local town council, right? Do it on that hyper local level. You don't even have to just go to Congress, right? You can start building awareness in your own communities. And we have a toolkit that gives you all the information on how to do all of that. I mean, it's simple as even a library. You can, I did this last year. My local library put up a little display in the library for Migraine and Headache Awareness Month. And, it seems like a simple thing, but I am hopeful that somebody in my town walked by that and, stopped and thought about migraine maybe for the first time and maybe talked to their doctor next time because they saw something and got some education and awareness. So those little things can make a huge difference. So I would say, there's a place for you in this movement. There's so many different ways to get involved. Just take that first step and, visit the website and learn about some of the different ways.
Yeah. So many great ways to get involved. You just mentioned there are tons of different ways, and everybody's got their unique challenges, and everybody has, some people can't travel and stuff, but just going to show that even something small can really make a big difference, especially if we do it collectively. There are over 40 million of us, so just think about what we can accomplish if all of us get involved. So I'll be sure to include the links to the website and the social media and the show notes. And if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please share it with anybody you know who might be interested in headache advocacy. And if you're open to it, please leave us a 5-star review. It really helps get this podcast to the right people. Thank you, Julian, for being on.
Thanks so much for having me.